A cold, lifeless body lay slumped on the concrete floor of a maximum security prison, bearing the mark of an armed robber whose veins were riddled with drugs. Yet that gaunt criminal face was the very same innocent icon once beloved by millions of American families, the golden boy who made the Disney Empire and the blockbuster Star Trek. Two stark contrasts, a social outcast and a Hollywood star, ironically converged in a single name, Carl Stephen. From the heights of dazzling fame to the dark depths of the criminal system, what cruel tragedy transformed a child who brought smiles to the world into an exploited commodity, destined to die a slow, lonely death behind bars? The transformation from beloved child star to armed robber begins within the industrial machinery of 1980s Hollywood. This was an era characterized by a voracious, insatiable appetite for sanitized, manufactured innocence. The entertainment landscape was a booming, highly competitive enterprise of family-friendly comedies and lucrative merchandising rights. In this ruthless economic ecosystem, a child actor is not viewed as a developing human being. They are viewed as intellectual property. Carl Stephen was perfectly positioned as a premium product within this machine. He did not possess the overly polished, artificial veneer of the stage school veterans. He possessed a naturalistic, slightly awkward charm that casting directors craved. He was a blank slate onto which audiences could project their own desires for safety and wonder. Born Carlos Stephen Krakoff in Glendale, California, he was the middle of three boys raised in the very shadow of the Los Angeles studio lots. Unlike the aggressively ambitious stage children imported from across the country, Carlo was a local kid whose entry into the industry felt almost incidental. He possessed a gentle, unassuming demeanor that contrasted sharply with the high-stakes, cutthroat environment of his hometown. When Carl stepped into the sprawling, intimidating mythology of the cosmos, in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, playing the young, rapidly aging Vulcan, he was subjected to the intense, granular scrutiny of a massive franchise. When he lent his youthful voice to a beloved cultural institution, as a young Fred Jones in a pup named Scooby-Doo, he was learning to compress his identity into a vocal performance designed to sell cereal and toys. And when he secured his place in cinematic history in the blockbuster Titan, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, he became a permanent fixture in the collective memory of a generation, playing the endearingly awkward neighbor Tommy Purvis. He did not rely on the polished theatrical delivery typical of child actors. Instead, he brought a genuine, slightly clumsy vulnerability to the screen that resonated deeply with young audiences. This authentic awkwardness was not a calculated performance technique. It was the natural disposition of a quiet kid trying to navigate a chaotic, oversized world. During these golden, frenetic years, Carl was surrounded by the intoxicating, dangerous illusion of permanence. He was a celebrated entity, a high-yield investment generating substantial returns for the multinational studios that employed him. He was ushered onto sound stages by teams of handlers, his diet monitored, his schooling squeezed into 15-minute increments, mandated by child labor laws. The adults in the room, the directors, the producers, the studio executives, treated him with the deferential respect usually reserved for visiting royalty. But this respect was entirely transactional. It was contingent upon his ability to hit his mark, remember his lines, and most importantly, remain exactly as he was. Hollywood's business model relies heavily on selling youth. Studios bank on the missing front teeth, the high-pitched voice, and the cherubic cheeks. But children inevitably grow up. From the moment the camera rolled, Carl was an asset with a rapidly approaching expiration date. The psychological environment of a soundstage for a young boy like Carl is profoundly disorienting. It is a windowless box where time is manipulated by an assistant director, where seasons change at the flick of a lighting switch, and where emotional outbursts are scheduled for take 4. In this artificial vacuum, the normal milestones of childhood development, making mistakes, exploring identity, learning to navigate peer groups without the interference of a script, are completely obliterated. Carl's identity was not formed on a playground. It was formed under the harsh glare of Klieg lights. He learned very early on that affection, validation, and his own self-worth were conditional. He was valuable only as long as the red light on the camera was illuminated. When the director called cut, the illusion dissolved, leaving a young boy holding the immense, crushing responsibility of a multi-million-dollar production on his narrow shoulders. The public's appetite demanded a perpetual Peter Pan, but as the late 80s bled into the 90s, the transition from the golden boy of family cinema to an obsolete asset began with the unavoidable onset of puberty. Carl's missing front teeth and high-pitched voice were replaced by an unpredictable, unmarketable baritone. The soft contours of his face elongated and sharpened. For a child star, this physical evolution is not viewed as growth. In the brutal, unforgiving calculus of Hollywood casting, it is simply a breach of contract. The studios had extracted the raw material they needed from his youth, captured his innocence on 35mm film, packaged it, and sold it. Now, having sacrificed his formative years to build their empires, he was a product rapidly approaching its expiration date, about to be handed a severance package of total, suffocating obscurity. The rejection did not come through a formal meeting, but through a series of increasingly humiliating auditions where casting directors scrutinized his changing features with undisguised disappointment. He would stand under the harsh fluorescent lights of cramped casting rooms, reading lines meant for younger kids, painfully aware that his deepening voice was betraying him. The warm smiles and enthusiastic praises that once greeted him were replaced by polite nods and swift dismissals, signaling his transition from a coveted asset to a burdensome liability. When his voice deepened and his features sharpened, the industry simply stopped calling. For a child who has spent his formative years entirely conditioned by the relentless rhythm of production schedules, call sheets, and the intoxicating validation of applause, the abrupt cessation of this attention is a psychological trauma of unimaginable proportions. The phone, which had once rung incessantly with offers for voiceover work, television guest appearances, and feature films, simply stopped ringing. The powerful agents and managers who had once hovered around him, orchestrating his every career move with the precision of military tacticians, suddenly became unreachable, their attention seamlessly redirected to the next crop of 7-year-olds waiting eagerly in the wings. Carl found himself abruptly exiled from the only universe he had ever truly understood. The sound stages, with their towering light rigs and bustling crews, were replaced by the profound echoing emptiness of a normal teenage existence, a life he had no idea how to lead. This exile creates a unique and devastating form of alienation. Returning to the mundane reality of a traditional educational environment is an exercise in profound humiliation for a fading star. Carl was thrust into the chaotic, hierarchical world of high school, stripped of his protective entourage and his VIP status. To his peers, he was a walking anachronism, a ghost of a television show they had watched half a decade ago. He was the kid from the movie, but he was no longer that kid. The teenagers around him were navigating the complexities of adolescence with a shared collective clumsiness, but Carl was navigating it beneath the heavy, suffocating shroud of past fame. He was burdened by an identity that no longer existed, expected to be the cheerful, unproblematic boy from the Disney films, while simultaneously wrestling with the profound grief of losing his entire career before he was even legally permitted to drive a car. This profound disconnect fosters a deep internalized isolation. He was surrounded by people, yet he was entirely alone, trapped in the melancholic echo chamber of his own redundant celebrity. Navigating the crowded hallways, he endured the cruel whispers and pointed stares of teenagers who recognized his face but ridiculed his sudden lack of status. The mundane rituals of locker combinations and cafeteria seating felt alien to a boy whose previous meals were catered affairs coordinated by production assistants. He possessed no shared history with these peers, lacking the fundamental social vocabulary built on neighborhood playgrounds and little league games. Despite this profound internal isolation, Carl made a concerted effort to build a conventional life after officially retiring from acting in 1996. He married his wife Dawn in 1998 and later welcomed a son Noah, attempting to anchor his identity in the grounding responsibilities of fatherhood. Holding Noah offered a fragile, fleeting glimpse of unconditional love, a stark contrast to the transactional affection he had experienced on sound stages. He traded scripts for bedtime stories, desperately trying to construct a protective barrier around his new family, hoping the quiet routine of suburban life would permanently silence the ghosts of his past. For a brief moment, the title of a father felt far more significant than any character name he had ever seen printed on a call sheet. For a brief period, he seemed to be constructing a quiet, meaningful existence far removed from the glare of the cameras. In the years following his departure from the screen, the trajectory of his life took a dark turn. While exact medical records remain private, numerous biographical accounts suggest his initial exposure to opioids began with a prescription for painkillers following a routine tonsillectomy. It was within this legally sanctioned transaction that many believed the second, far more lethal phase of his tragedy was quietly initiated. Like countless victims of the American opioid epidemic, the descent often begins not in a dark alley, but in a doctor's office. While the exact genesis of his dependency remains shrouded in the privacy of medical records, the transition from sanctioned pharmaceuticals to illicit street heroin is a well-documented and devastating pipeline. This is the great, terrifying deception of the modern opioid epidemic, a trap perfectly designed to ensnare a young man desperate for an escape. When Carl presented that first prescription to the pharmacist, there was no stigma attached to the transaction. There was no exchange of illicit cash in a dimly lit alleyway, no interaction with hardened criminals. He was simply a patient picking up his medicine, perfectly sanctioned by the law and endorsed by medical science. The pills, sitting innocuously in their amber plastic vial, represented a culturally accepted, perfectly sterile solution to his agony. As the first pill dissolved into his bloodstream, it did not merely numb the surgical incision in his throat. It aggressively silenced the relentless, critical voice echoing in his mind. The heavy, suffocating mantle of failure that had draped over his shoulders since his forced retirement was instantly lifted, replaced by a profound artificial lightness. Opioids quickly replaced the validation he once sought on film sets, providing a chemical escape that required no performance. The prescribed opioids did more than dull his physical pain. They offered a temporary chemical escape from the quiet anxieties of a fading career. The drugs enveloped his central nervous system in a thick, impenetrable blanket of synthetic warmth. For the first time since the devastating silence of the casting directors began, the anxiety, the profound sense of worthlessness, and the crushing weight of his irrelevance were entirely muted. The painkillers decoupled his mind from the unbearable reality of his existence. The agonizing memory of his lost fame, the stinging humiliation of his current obscurity, the terrifying uncertainty of a future without a script, all of it dissolved into a soft, manageable golden haze. The pills provided a chemical sanctuary, a perfectly controlled environment where the pain of being a forgotten child, Star simply ceased to exist. This chemical embrace is seductive beyond human comprehension for a young man whose brain had been fundamentally wired to crave the external validation of a director's praise. The opioids provided an immediate, reliable, and infinitely superior dopamine response. He no longer needed a camera, a script, or an audience to feel a sense of profound transcendent well-being. The validation was now available in a standardized milligram-measured dosage. However, the tragedy of prescription opioids lies in their merciless biological mathematics. The human body, in its relentless pursuit of homeostasis, quickly adapts to the presence of the foreign chemical. The initial dosage, which had provided such miraculous sweeping relief, rapidly loses its efficacy. The golden haze begins to thin, allowing the sharp, jagged edges of reality to pierce through once more. To maintain the barrier, to keep the crushing weight of the world at bay, the dosage must be increased. It is a slow, methodical escalation, often hidden behind the legitimate veneer of managing breakthrough pain. Carl found himself returning to the doctor's office, articulating the return of his symptoms, seeking the necessary authorization to procure a higher concentration of the very substance that was slowly dismantling his neurochemistry. Many analysts of the opioid epidemic note that during this era, prescriptions were frequently refilled and dosages increased. This systemic practice often inadvertently accelerated dependency, transforming a prescribed treatment into a lethal reliance. The prescriptions were rewritten, the dosages doubled, and the frequency increased. This phase of the tragedy is characterized by a silent, invisible erosion of the self. Outwardly, Carl may have still resembled the young man trying to navigate a post-Hollywood life, but inwardly, the architecture of his personality was being systematically rewired by the narcotics. The young actor, who had memorized complex dialogue and hit precise marks on a chaotic film set, was now devoting his considerable cognitive resources to the complex logistics of his prescription management. His daily routine, once dictated by the call sheet, was now entirely governed by the half-life of the pills in his bloodstream. The anxiety of securing the next refill superseded all other human motivations. Friendships, familial relationships, and any lingering ambitions for a normal life were subordinated to the absolute, totalitarian demands of the chemical dependency. His addiction silently tore his family apart. The quiet life he had built with Dawn and his young son was consumed by the gravity of his dependency. He was no longer a present father or a reliable husband. His parental instincts were entirely overshadowed by the desperate need to secure his next dose. The financial burden of this escalating reliance is staggering. Pharmaceutical opioids, particularly when consumed at a rate far exceeding the recommended therapeutic dosage, require substantial capital. The financial reserves generated during his years as a child star, intended to provide a foundation for his adult life, were quietly and efficiently liquidated at the pharmacy counter. The money earned from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, the residuals from his voiceover work, the compensation for his lost childhood, it was all slowly converted into little white pills. The tragedy is that he was paying exorbitant sums to finance his own erasure. He was trapped in a perfectly legal, medically sanctioned Ouroboros, consuming the wealth of his past to anesthetize the pain of his present, whilst completely obliterating any possibility of a future. As the dependency deepened, the safety and sterility of the prescription pad began to fracture. Doctors, increasingly wary of the astronomical quantities of narcotics they were authorizing, eventually began to pull back. The legal avenues for procuring his chemical sanctuary were rapidly strangled by medical bureaucracy and dwindling funds. The medical establishment, having initiated his physical dependency with the stroke of a pen, was now abandoning him to the consequences. When the legitimate prescriptions were finally severed, Carl was introduced to the sheer, unadulterated terror of withdrawal. The central nervous system, artificially suppressed for years, rebounded with catastrophic violence. It is a violent cellular mutiny characterized by a bone-deep, radiating agony that feels as though the marrow itself is turning to ground glass. In this waking nightmare of relentless physical and psychological terror, the concept of consequence evaporates. The mind narrows its focus to a singular, all-consuming objective, the restoration of chemical equilibrium. It is a biological imperative that makes a mockery of free will, transforming the sufferer into a desperate machine programmed solely to seek out relief, regardless of the cost. It was within this crucible of unimaginable physical and mental anguish that the former child star was introduced to the dark, unforgiving mathematics of the street economy. Pharmaceutical pills, particularly on the black market, command exorbitant prices, entirely unfeasible for a young man whose financial reserves had already been liquidated to fund his initial legal dependency. The street, however, offers a ruthlessly efficient, horrifyingly accessible alternative. Heroin, the illicit, unrefined cousin of the clinical painkiller, provided the exact same synthetic refuge at a fraction of the cost. The psychological barrier that prevents most individuals from engaging with a substance so heavily stigmatized, so culturally synonymous with decay and death, is effortlessly obliterated by the sheer, overwhelming terror of withdrawal. For Carl, the transition was not a moral failing. It was a desperate, primal act of self-medication. The drug did not care about his past, It did not care that he had once shared the screen with cinematic legends, or that his voice had been broadcast into millions of living rooms on Saturday mornings. Heroin is the ultimate equalizer. It strips away the accolades, the residuals, and the fading clippings of a Hollywood career, reducing the individual to a single pulsating nerve ending demanding to be anesthetized. When the heroin entered his bloodstream, the transformation of Carl Steven was absolute and irreversible. The boy from the Disney films, the cheerful, accessible avatar of American innocence, was dismantled, replaced by a man driven entirely by the mechanics of addiction. Heroin addiction dictated the rhythm of his daily life, completely reconfiguring his priorities for survival on the streets. The entire architecture of his life was reconfigured to serve the drug. The skills he had learned on the sound stages of Los Angeles, the ability to hit a mark, to memorize a script, to project an emotion he did not genuinely feel, were now repurposed for survival in a dangerous subterranean world. He learned how to navigate the illicit drug markets, how to identify reliable dealers, and how to spot the undercover police officers who police the margins of society. The profound tragedy of this descent is magnified by the stark contrast between his past and his present. He was a young man who had once been protected by layers of publicists, agents, and studio executives, a valuable asset shielded from the harsh realities of the world. Now, he was entirely exposed, existing in a perilous landscape where violence and exploitation were the standard currency, and where his former fame offered absolutely no protection. In fact, in the ruthless hierarchy of the streets, a former child star is often viewed as a mark, a weak, privileged individual to be exploited and discarded. As his tolerance to the heroin inevitably climbed, the financial demands of his addiction accelerated with terrifying speed. The desperate hustle of the street-level addict, the pawning of personal possessions, the borrowing of money that will never be repaid, the petty thefts that erode the last remnants of personal dignity, eventually proved insufficient to feed the ravenous hunger of his veins. Heroin creates a vacuum that consumes everything in its proximity, and when the semi-legitimate avenues of funding were exhausted, the vacuum consumed everything. As his financial reserves vanished, Carl crossed a final violent threshold, driven by a relentless biological need for a drug that was destroying him. The former child actor armed himself. The decision to pick up a weapon and walk into a commercial establishment with the intent to steal is a Rubicon that, once crossed, fundamentally alters the trajectory of a human life. It requires a complete subjugation of empathy and a total detachment from the societal contract. Yet for an individual in the throes of severe heroin addiction, the weapon is not viewed as an instrument of violence. It is viewed merely as a tool of extraction, a necessary prop to secure the funds required to stave off the encroaching agony of withdrawal. Carl began to target local businesses, pharmacies, and convenience stores, the very establishments that, ironically, might have once stocked the magazines featuring his cherubic face. The theatrics of an armed robbery bear a dark, twisted resemblance to the mechanics of a film production. It requires a script, a costume, a specific choreography of movement, and the ability to command the attention of an audience. The boy who had spent his formative years learning how to control a room on a soundstage now utilized those deeply ingrained skills to terrorize pharmacists. Gripping the cold steel of the firearm, beneath his jacket his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, mirroring the adrenaline surges he used to feel right before stepping onto a major set. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the targeted convenience stores cast long distorted shadows, creating a grotesque miniature stage where he was both the villain and the desperate victim. He delivered his demands with a terrifying hollow conviction, exploiting the variability to project authority and emotion that had once made him a beloved household name. He hid his once valuable face behind a mask, leveling a weapon at terrified employees to demand cash and prescription narcotics. The heartwarming family comedies were replaced by a very real, incredibly dangerous crime drama of his own making, transforming the former child star into an anonymous specter of violence. The sheer terror of the robbery was momentarily eclipsed by the overwhelming relief that followed once the heroin was purchased. For a few fleeting hours, the agony subsided. The trembling stopped, the bone-deep ache subsided, and the crushing weight of his tragic reality was temporarily suspended. But this relief was entirely illusory, a momentary pause in an accelerating cycle of destruction. The half-life of heroin is cruelly short. Within hours, the sanctuary would begin to dissolve. The sickness would begin to creep back into his muscles, and the frantic, terrifying calculus of the next robbery would have to begin all over again. This chaotic, violent lifestyle is fundamentally unsustainable. The mechanics of addiction ensure that the user becomes increasingly reckless, their judgment clouded by the relentless demand for the drug. The robberies become sloppier, the risks more pronounced, and the trail of evidence more glaring. The law enforcement agencies operating with the cold, methodical efficiency of an entirely different kind of machine began to close the net around him. The police did not see a fallen Hollywood angel. They saw a dangerous, unpredictable armed robber terrorizing their jurisdiction. They analyzed the patterns, reviewed the security footage, and methodically built their case against the anonymous phantom who was holding up their local businesses. The collision between Carl Stephen and the judicial system was not a matter of if, but rather a matter of when. The inevitable climax of this dark chapter arrived in 2009. The facade completely crumbled. The mask was ripped away, and the terrifying reality of his existence was exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of the public record. Carl was apprehended by law enforcement. The cold steel of the handcuffs, a stark physical manifestation of the chains that had been binding his soul for years. The arrest must have been a moment of profound, shattering clarity, a terrifying awakening from the long chemically induced nightmare of his addiction. The harsh glare of the red and blue sirens painted the desolate street in alternating strokes of violent color, illuminating the exhausted, hollowed-out contours of his face. He offered no resistance as the officers pushed him against the cold metal of the cruiser, his body entirely depleted of the chaotic energy that had fueled his crime spree. The metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists resonated with a terrifying finality, severing his last desperate connection to the free world. As he was processed into the system, fingerprinted and photographed, the full, devastating weight of his actions finally collapsed upon him. The 2009 mugshot stands as a tragic counterpoint to his retouched childhood headshots. The eyes that once sparked with cinematic wonder were now vacant, haunted by the ghosts of his addiction. By 2009, his Hollywood resume was replaced by a criminal record. The illusion of cinema traded for the grim reality of the American penal system. The transition from the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled desperation of the streets to the sterile, methodical machinery of the American judicial system is a profound and jarring psychological whiplash. For Carl Stephen, the journey from the flashing lights of his arrest to the courtroom represented the final severing of his ties to the world he once knew. The sole purpose of this legal process was to categorize his failures and assign a numerical value to his transgressions in the form of a prison sentence. Following his arrest in 2009, the charming talent of his youth had vanished behind the physical toll of severe addiction. To the prosecution, the judge, and the legal apparatus of the state, he was stripped of his history, his context, and his humanity. He was reduced entirely to the cold binary terminology of the penal code: a defendant, a felon, an armed robber. The complex, devastatingly sad narrative of his life, the predatory commodification of his childhood by the entertainment industry, the subsequent abandonment when he outgrew his marketability, and the catastrophic initiation into opioid dependency by the very medical professionals sworn to do no harm, was deemed largely irrelevant by a system designed to punish actions rather than treat root causes. To the legal apparatus of Arizona, his Hollywood history and his struggle with addiction were irrelevant. The court did not see a fallen star or a chronically ill patient. It saw only a desperate man with a weapon, a threat to public order that needed to be locked away. As the legal proceedings unfolded, one can only speculate on the profound sense of disassociation Carl must have experienced. Did he listen to the prosecutors dissect his crimes with the detached analytical ear of an actor reviewing a poorly written script? Or was he entirely consumed by the crushing, suffocating terror of his impending fate, his body still fundamentally ravaged by the lingering skeletal ache of heroin withdrawal? The defense counsel, regardless of their proficiency, faced an insurmountable task. The evidence of the armed robberies was likely incontrovertible, a desperate, sloppy trail of desperation left by a man whose cognitive functions had been entirely hijacked by chemical dependency. Any attempt to contextualize his actions, to plead for leniency based upon the extraordinary and tragic circumstances of his fall from grace, would have crashed against the immovable wall of mandatory minimums and the rigid, unforgiving architecture of criminal sentencing guidelines. The court was not interested in the tragedy of the discarded child star. It was interested only in the swift and efficient administration of punishment. In 2010, the judge delivered the final sentence: 13 years in the state penitentiary system. For a man in his mid-30s, a sentence of that magnitude is not merely a penalty, it is an amputation of the future. 13 years represents an entire epoch of a human life. It means the total surrender of autonomy, the complete cessation of personal growth, and the erasure of all meaningful participation in society. For Carl, whose life had previously been measured in television seasons, box office opening weekends, and the frantic hourly countdowns to his next chemical fix, a block of 13 years must have seemed like an incomprehensible eternity. The sentence mathematically guaranteed that his youth was officially irreversibly extinguished. The man who would eventually emerge from those prison walls, assuming he survived the ordeal, would be a middle-aged ghost, institutionalized, stigmatized, and entirely alien to the world outside. The pronouncement of that number severed the final thread of hope, condemning him to a prolonged, agonizing existence in one of the most brutal and unforgiving environments on the planet. The physical transportation from the county holding facility to the state penitentiary is a masterclass in psychological subjugation. Prisoners are typically shackled together, chained at the wrists, the waist, and the ankles, transforming a group of individual human beings into a clanking, shuffling, homogeneous mass of state property. As the transport bus navigated the arid, sun-scorched highways of Arizona, heading towards the imposing, heavily fortified compounds of the Department of Corrections, the physical geography mirrored the utter desolation of Carl's internal landscape. The desert, with its sprawling, indifferent emptiness, served as a stark preview of the emotional and sensory deprivation that awaited him. The windows of the bus, covered in heavy metal mesh, fractured the outside world into tiny, inaccessible squares, a visual representation of his sudden, absolute separation from freedom. Every jolt of the suspension, every clinking of the heavy steel chains reinforced the terrifying reality of his new existence. Stripped of his former identity, he was transported to the Arizona Department of Corrections, transitioning from a recognized individual to a ward of the state. The intake process at a maximum security state prison is deliberately designed to strip away the final vestiges of individual identity, systematically breaking down the human ego to ensure total compliance with the institutional hierarchy. Upon arrival, the men are subjected to a series of degrading, highly invasive procedures. They are forced to strip naked in front of armed guards and other inmates, subjected to full-body searches that violate every fundamental boundary of personal dignity. They are sprayed with delousing chemicals, their hair often shorn close to the scalp, erasing any personal aesthetic choices. The civilian clothes they arrived in, the last physical remnants of their former lives, are confiscated, bagged, and stored away, replaced by the coarse, brightly colored, ill-fitting uniforms of the state. For Carl, this uniform was the final devastating costume of his career. It was a garment designed not to highlight his features or to endear him to an audience, but to mark him as a pariah, to make him highly visible to the guards in the event of an escape, and to visually amalgamate him into the general population of violent offenders. Along with the uniform, he was issued a Department of Corrections identification number. This string of digits permanently replaced his name on all official documentation, becoming the sole identifier by which the state recognized his existence. The erasure was now absolute and total. Entering the general population of the Tucson prison facility is an assault on the human senses that defies description. It is a chaotic, hyper-masculine, profoundly violent microcosm of society's most dangerous elements, compressed into a concrete and steel pressure cooker. The architectural design of the facility is inherently hostile, consisting of long, echoing tiers of identical cells, heavy steel doors that slam shut with a concussive, bone-rattling finality, and fluorescent lighting that hums with a relentless, maddening frequency. The noise is constant and oppressive, a cacophony of shouting, the clattering of metal on metal, the blaring of intercom systems, and the underlying perpetual murmur of thousands of men confined in unnatural proximity. The air is stagnant, heavy with the scent of industrial cleaning chemicals, stale sweat, and the palpable, suffocating tension of impending violence. For a young man whose early life was characterized by the plush, comfortable trailers of film sets and the affluent suburbs of Los Angeles, stepping onto the tier of a maximum security cell block was akin to being dropped onto an alien, actively hostile planet. Within this brutal ecosystem, the internal hierarchy is established and maintained through intimidation, physical prowess, and sheer, uncompromising violence. Weakness is instantly recognized and ruthlessly exploited. A new inmate, particularly one with a slight build and a background entirely divorced from the realities of street gangs and organized crime, is immediately assessed as potential prey. The fact that Carl was a former celebrity, a face that some of the inmates might have vaguely recognized from their own childhoods, offered absolutely no protection. On the contrary, it likely painted an even larger target on his back. In the twisted predatory logic of the prison yard, a former child star is viewed as a privileged, soft outsider, someone who has fallen from grace and is entirely unequipped for the brutal realities of survival. The fame that had once insulated him from the harshness of the world was now a dangerous liability, a marker of his fundamental difference from the hardened, institutionalized men who surrounded him. He had to learn, with terrifying speed, how to navigate the complex, invisible boundaries of racial segregation, gang territories, and the unwritten lethal rules of inmate conduct. A misplaced glance, a perceived slight, or a failure to align with the correct faction could result in swift, severe, and potentially fatal retribution. The recreation yard was a deadly chessboard where every step, every conversation, and every micro-expression was heavily scrutinized by rival gangs holding absolute power. He had to suppress every instinct of human warmth, adopting a permanent stony grimace to mask the profound soul-crushing terror that accompanied his every waking hour. The constant underlying threat of violence and extortion hung in the stagnant air, forcing him into a state of hypervigilance that slowly frayed the edges of his sanity. The Arizona penal system was not built for rehabilitation. It was not a hospital, nor a therapeutic environment designed to heal profound neurochemical imbalances. Instead, it was a concrete warehouse where deeply traumatized addicts were placed in forced claustrophobic proximity to the very illicit narcotics that had destroyed them on the outside. These punitive facilities were designed to inflict suffering and maintain control. The idea that stripping a man of his dignity, subjecting him to the constant threat of violence, isolating him from all meaningful human connection, and caging him like an animal will somehow repair the fractures in his soul, is a logical fallacy of catastrophic proportions. For Carl Stephen, the prison walls did not represent a sanctuary from his demons. They merely confined him in a smaller, much more dangerous room with them. The cruelest irony of his incarceration was the absolute failure of the institution to fulfill its most basic mandate, to keep the contraband out. One might reasonably assume that a maximum security facility, fortified by layers of razor wire, concrete walls, electronic surveillance, and armed personnel, would be an impenetrable fortress against the illicit drug trade. However, the black market economy within the prison system is as robust, innovative, and resilient as any global financial network. Heroin, The very substance that had systematically dismantled Carl's life on the outside effortlessly penetrated the heavily guarded perimeter of the Tucson facility. It arrived through a multitude of compromised channels, smuggled by compromised staff members, brought in by visitors, or transported through the complex, clandestine networks established by the powerful prison gangs. The walls did not eradicate the presence of the drug. They merely artificially inflated its value and drastically increased the danger associated with its consumption. In the artificial, deprived economy of the prison, drugs function as the ultimate currency, a commodity far more valuable than cash. They are used to purchase protection, to pay off debts, and to secure a fleeting, desperate escape from the agonizing reality of confinement. For an addict locked in a cell, the presence of heroin within the facility is an exquisite, unrelenting form of psychological torture. On the outside, an addict must hustle, steal, and navigate the dangers of the street to procure their fix, but they possess the illusion of autonomy. They can choose to walk away, to seek a clinic, to change their geography. Inside the prison, there is no escape. The drug is ubiquitous, controlled by ruthless syndicates who actively prey upon the desperation of the addicted inmates. The temptation is ever present, whispering through the ventilation shafts, traded in the shadows of the recreation yard, and weaponized by the predators who run the cell blocks. If Carl had entered the facility with a genuine, desperate hope of getting clean, of using his 13-year sentence to purge the synthetic poison from his central nervous system and rebuild the shattered architecture of his mind, that hope would have been systematically crushed by the sheer availability of the drug. The prison did not separate him from his addiction. It trapped him in a cage with it, ensuring that his daily existence remained a constant, excruciating battle against his own biological cravings in an environment explicitly designed to break his willpower. The psychological toll of maintaining an addiction behind bars is devastating. The cost of the drug is astronomical, and the methods required to finance a habit inside are fraught with extreme peril. Inmates who owe drug debts to the gangs are subjected to horrific violence, extortion, and sexual assault. They are forced to carry out assaults on other inmates, to hold contraband, or to serve as foot soldiers in the endless bloody skirmishes that dictate prison politics. Surviving this ecosystem required terrifying compromises. Debts inside a maximum security prison are paid through violence, extortion, or absolute subjugation. The boy who had once smiled out from the covers of teen magazines, entirely innocent of the darkness that lay ahead, was now navigating a subterranean, violent economy where his life was valued at less than a fraction of a gram of smuggled narcotics. The tragedy was compounding, folding back in on itself as the very institution designed to punish his crimes became the facilitator of his ultimate fatal relapse. To survive the day-to-day reality of this environment requires a profound defensive disassociation. An inmate must learn to switch off their emotional receptors, to harden their heart against the suffering of others, and to suppress any display of vulnerability. Empathy is a lethal liability in a maximum security prison. Carl would have had to bury whatever remained of his gentle artistic disposition beneath a thick, impenetrable armor of stoicism and hypervigilance. He would have to learn to sleep with one eye open, to interpret the subtle shifts in the ambient noise of the cell block that precede an act of violence and to accept the total crushing lack of privacy as his new normal. Every aspect of his daily routine, when he ate, when he slept, when he was permitted to stand under the lukewarm water of the communal showers, and when he was allowed to breathe the fresh air of the heavily monitored yard, was dictated by the arbitrary, often cruel whims of the correctional officers and the rigid schedule of the institution. He was reduced to a state of perpetual infancy, entirely dependent upon a system that fundamentally despised his existence. The deep, profound isolation of a long-term prison sentence is an acid that slowly eats away at the soul. While he was surrounded by hundreds of other men, the connections formed in prison are rarely based on genuine affection or mutual respect. They are alliances of convenience, fraught with suspicion and the constant threat of betrayal. The true isolation stems from the severing of ties to the outside world. The letters become less frequent, the phone calls more strained, and the visits eventually cease as the sheer logistical and emotional burden of maintaining a relationship with an incarcerated individual takes its toll on friends and family. The world outside continues to spin, to evolve, and to forget. The children grow up, the parents age, the cultural landscape shifts, and the prisoner is left frozen in time, locked in a concrete box, staring at a calendar that measures a future he is not permitted to participate in. For a former child star, this isolation is uniquely painful. Carl knew with absolute agonizing certainty that the public who had once adored him had entirely erased him from their collective memory. He was a phantom, a piece of discarded pop culture trivia, rotting away in a cell, while the entertainment machine that had consumed his youth continued to churn out new, shiny, disposable idols. As the years of his sentence stretched out before him, a vast, unbroken expanse of concrete and steel, the sheer weight of his situation must have been suffocating. He was not serving a short stint. He was facing over a decade of sensory deprivation, threat, and chemical temptation. The human mind is remarkably resilient, capable of adapting to even the most horrific circumstances, but the combination of profound psychological trauma, severe, untreated opioid dependency, and the crushing despair of a 13-year sentence in a hostile environment is a cocktail that systematically degrades the will to live. The drug, always present, always waiting in the shadows of the tier, offered the only reliable escape from the madness of his reality. It promised to blur the sharp, terrifying edges of his confinement, to quiet the relentless, screaming anxiety of his circumstances, and to transport him, if only for a few hours, back to the golden, painless sanctuary of oblivion. The system had locked Carl Stephen in a cage, stripped him of his identity, and entirely failed to stem the flow of the poison that had destroyed him on the outside. Society had washed its hands of him, content to let him vanish into the dark bowels of the prison industrial complex. He was trapped without a safety net, consumed by a machine that had no use for his survival. As the suffocating heat of July 2011 settled over the Tucson facility, the prison routine continued with mechanical indifference. The profound isolation, the untreated trauma of his discarded childhood, and the biological tyranny of heroin converged into a singularity of despair. In the shadows of the tier, Carl secured the smuggled substance, unaware that his long nightmare was mere hours away from its conclusion. The final hours of his life unfolded in the windowless microcosm of his cell on July 31st, 2011. The former star who once navigated Hollywood sound stages was now confined to a space designed specifically to crush the human spirit. He held the illicit contraband representing the catastrophic culmination of his trajectory, from globally recognized star to armed robber. The heroin procured through the violent prison yard economy was the physical embodiment of a systemic failure. It was the lethal concluding chapter of a child star tragedy. As he prepared the narcotic-utilizing crude paraphernalia, he enacted the final ritual of a man hollowed out by the institution supposed to protect him. The industry had commodified his childhood innocence, selling his cherubic smile to millions, but discarded him into irrelevance when adolescence rendered him unmarketable. The medical establishment then anesthetized his psychological trauma with highly addictive opioids. Finally, the penal system locked him in a cage, failing to sever his access to the street narcotics that replaced his prescriptions. Introducing the lethal dose of heroin into his bloodstream, he sought the only permanent sanctuary available to a man the world had forsaken. The concrete walls of the cell seemed to close in, sweating in the oppressive Arizona heat as he tied the crude tourniquet around his scarred arm. His hands, which had once signed thousands of autographs for eager children, now trembled violently as they manipulated the smuggled syringe. In the deafening silence of the night, broken only by the synchronized breathing of the men trapped in the adjacent cages, he pushed the plunger down, surrendering the last ragged shreds of his existence to the dark. As the lethal dose of heroin crossed the blood-brain barrier, it suppressed his central nervous system. As Carl slipped into a chemically induced coma on his steel bunk, his breathing slowed, then stopped entirely. The oxygen levels in his blood plummeted. His heart fought a brief battle against the encroaching hypoxia before the muscular tissue itself failed. In the absolute isolation of his cell, surrounded by hundreds of sleeping men, the 36-year-old slipped over the precipice. The icon of childhood innocence died entirely alone in the dark. The discovery of his lifeless body occurred several hours later during the morning count. As a guard walked the tier, the terrifying stillness in Carl's cell registered as an anomaly. Protocol for an unresponsive inmate was initiated with chaotic urgency. Heavy boots pounded the concrete, radios crackled, and the cell door was forcefully breached. The immediate reality of the scene, the cyanotic skin, the lack of a pulse, and the dilated pupils, rendered any hope of resuscitation obsolete. Nevertheless, institutional protocols demanded a performative display of medical intervention. Paramedics engaged in a futile attempt to restart his heart. Chest compressions forced air into dead lungs, but the biological machinery had completely failed. Carl Stephen was officially pronounced dead on the cold floor of the Tucson facility. The immediate aftermath was characterized by clinical bureaucracy. His cell was transformed into a sterile crime scene, photographed by internal investigators, searching for evidence of the contraband that bypassed their security infrastructure. His body was unceremoniously zipped into a heavy bag and transported to the medical examiner's office, reducing his human experience to biological evidence. On the stainless steel tables of the morgue, a methodical autopsy mapped the catastrophic physical toll of his addiction. The toxicology report provided the definitive chemical signature of his demise, acute heroin toxicity. The Stark document offered no context for the sequence of institutional failures that led a beloved actor to inject a lethal dose of street narcotics in maximum security. It was the final reduction of a human life into a single data point in the opioid epidemic. When the news filtered into public consciousness, the reaction was a chilling indictment of a culture that consumes and discards its idols. There were no televised vigils or emotional tributes. Media coverage was brief, sensationalist, and heavily reliant on the superficial dichotomy of his life. Headlines exploited his dramatic fall from grace and the cell block overdose before swiftly moving on to the next piece of celebrity gossip. For the vast majority, Carl Steven was a ghost from a bygone era. His death was consumed as dark pop culture trivia, confirming the cynical narrative that child stars are inherently doomed. This collective amnesia allows the entertainment machine to operate with impunity, absolving studios and audiences of moral complicity in the destruction of the children they elevate to global fame. Carl Steven's legacy exposes the brutal efficiency of a system that commodifies youth only to punish the addiction it helped create. His story is the unvarnished truth of the child star tragedy. The industry extracted the financial value of his youth and discarded him without psychological support. The medical system offered him a highly addictive synthetic sanctuary when the pain became unbearable. When dependency drove him to criminal acts to survive withdrawal, the justice system locked him in a hyper-violent environment where the drug killing him was a primary tool of subterranean control. He was completely failed by every institution designed to protect the vulnerable. The haunting resonance of his story lies in the stark chasm between the perpetually smiling child preserved on celluloid and the broken 36-year-old man who drew his last breath in a prison cell. As long as Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and Star Trek III are broadcast, the phantom of his youth remains suspended in an innocent stasis, entirely divorced from his lived experience. He is a permanent fixture in collective childhood memories, yet he died entirely alone, consumed by a darkness the bright cinematic lights could never penetrate. His ashes serve as a silent monument to the disposable nature of human life in the pursuit of entertainment, and a warning about a society that would rather punish its broken children than attempt to heal them. The tragedy of Carl Steven is complete, leaving behind the inescapable truth that behind the manufactured innocence of the silver screen often lies a devastating darkness.